Hello everyone and welcome to our lecture on section 4.7 of Unit 4, talking about changing social hierarchies. The learning objective for this specific section in Unit 4 is to explain how social categories, roles, and practices have been maintained or changed over time. So that's a key thing to focus on here. This could be an essay question that you guys might get either in class, on the unit, or if you take the AP exam, it could come up. And obviously it's focusing on change and continuity over time and how these categories and roles in the social hierarchies could have changed or stayed the same. All right, so let's get into it. All right, so these are the illustrative examples that are in the curriculum framework. I want you guys to take a little bit of time, read these. You can pick out one or two of these, write some notes on them, focus on them, and know these. We'll talk about some of this stuff in a little bit more detail in this lecture, but these are the illustrative examples that are actually in the curriculum framework that you need to go over, at least one of them, and know one of them. All right, so let's do a little introduction that's going to kind of cover not only introducing this topic, but cover some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. So what we're seeing throughout this period is that societies are starting to face rebellions or some kind of tensions either outside or within their lands. Now, how do you look at it and say, well, outside? Well, what do we mean outside is like outside, like from a cultural standpoint. And what ends up happening is you see social hierarchies develop or transform because of these tensions and conflicts that are going to come about. And a big example of this that you guys are going to see throughout this particular lecture in this section is that European nations are going to expel Jews for their religious differences. For example, in Spain, they're expelled or forced to convert when the Reconquista actually ended and achieved by Spain in 1492. And what you'll see is those Jews actually, even though they're forced out of Europe or expelled from Europe, they actually find a place in this area to actually settle down in, which is in the Ottoman Empire. It becomes a safe haven for them. But more on that here in just a little bit. And with the development of these distinct social hierarchies, we see conflict. Now, this conflict can be open conflict in terms of warfare, or just social, political, economic tensions or conflict. And what we'll see is that royalty, nobility, scholars, and soldiers are going to fight for power and influence at various times and in different places. You're going to see in some societies a small middle class form, mostly made up of merchants and artisans. And then the majority of the population, regardless of where you're at, are going to be peasants and serfs or slaves, and they're often going to struggle to stay alive with very little opportunity to actually improve their lives. Now, during this period, for this sake of this topic, we're going to see that a lot of states are going to create some discriminatory policies against groups based on either one factor or a combination of the three that you see on screen of religion, ethnicity, or social class. One such example we've already talked about with the case of Jews in Europe. Another religious example would be the Huguenots or French Protestants and the persecution they faced for the majority of the French, which were Catholic. And then also you're going to see states that are going to support the formation of certain elite classes, and depending on the time frame, actions that are going on, or the particular area that we're at, you're actually going to see these elite classes in some cases support ruling power, whereas in other instances they challenge it. An example of that would be the Russian boyars, where early on they do support the ruling power, but then as things change, there is a little bit of a challenge to it. All right, so let's talk about the gunpowder empires. We're going to have 2 slides on them and how their social classes are developed and how they treat minorities. So regardless of which gunpowder empire that we talk about, whether it's the Ottomans, Safavids, or the Mughals, there are tensions that are going to exist between the absolute rulers of these empires and the elites, particularly the military elites of these empires. Now, we're not going to talk about the Safavids here. We're only going to mention the Ottomans with a little bit into the Mughals. So in Ottoman society was based on an aristocracy that was based on the warrior class, and a group of religious scholars, or the ulama, that was the main structure of their society underneath the royal family. And what this actually did between these warrior class or warrior aristocracy and the ulamas, you see a competition for power between these two groups. Now, ultimately, the janissaries within the military are going to gain the upper hand, but over time, they're actually going to mount several coups against the sultans as the sultans become increasingly weak. Now, one position that is actually going to become very powerful within this structure are the viziers. They're going to gain influence in a close ear with the Ottoman sultans. Again, they're going to become more effective and more influential in the social hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire as the Ottoman rulers become increasingly ineffective because of a number of factors, such as corruption or fratricide or whatever. You're going to see over time the Ottoman rulers become less and less skilled, and the viziers are going to take some power from them. Although they are going to maintain some power, in particular through the Timar system. It's a system where the Sultan would actually grant land or provide tax revenues to those he favored or those that showed loyalty to him, or to keep people loyal to him. And this gave the Ottoman Sultan some sort really, actually not some sort, but a really big instance of power to keep people in favor of his rule. Now, in terms of religious tolerance, where we actually talked about this here just on the introduction slide, the Ottomans are very religiously tolerant towards the Jews and Christians, but it's key to note that they didn't have full equality, even though they had some form of equality. They couldn't live in every area that you would think. They had to live only in specified areas. They did have to pay the religious tax that was required of all non-Muslims. That tax is known as the jizya. And they couldn't hold the top positions in the empire. But please make sure you guys do know, they could maintain or achieve pretty high levels within the Ottoman Empire, just not the top positions because they weren't Muslim. All right, a little bit more on the Ottomans themselves. Women actually ended up playing a little bit more of a role in the Ottoman social structure, mainly through their social and political role through the court, because it was common practice for Ottoman sultans to have many wives and concubines. And as those wives and concubines had children, they actually started to try to influence and promote the positions of their children. And this became known as harem politics. And there was a lot of the upper structures that actually pushed back against this. But one such example that was successful were a woman, she was European, she was taken as a slave and sold into the court of the harem of the Ottoman Emperor, was Roxolana. And she actually went from being his concubine to his wife, which was uncommon. And from her position as the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, she did a lot. She commissioned many different public works to help the internal running of the empire. But in particular, is even after Suleiman died, it was her son that actually succeeded Suleiman as sultan, which shows that it was possible, although rare, that women could gain status or some kind of influential place within the Ottoman social hierarchy. Now, the other Ottoman social classes, pretty straightforward across everything else that we're going to talk about. They had a very small middle class made up of merchants and artisans. Most of the people were peasants, and they had to pay tribute to the Ottoman government. And then there were slaves, and the slaves came from all across the empire. They couldn't be Muslim, however, so make sure you understand that. And then the last group here, they're not really part of the social class. They're just somebody that you need to understand because they're going to play a role a little bit later in history, are the Barbary pirates. And they're the kind of these pirates of the North African coast. They would capture and sell slaves from Europe or North Africa to the Ottoman Sultan, as well as impress people that they captured into the service on their own ships. And that'll actually become an issue if you take AP US history. The Barbary pirates will play a role here in terms of their impressment and what they're doing in this role here with American shipping in the early 1800s. And then lastly here, with the gunpowder empires, we have the Mughals. They practiced religious toleration specifically under Akbar the Great. And Akbar the Great was a really influential ruler. But he needed to keep this really big fractious empire together. And one of the ways he did that was he actually ended the jizya tax. So all non-Muslims didn't have to pay this special tax. He also granted land and money not just to Muslims, but Hindus, because those were the two main groups of the population in India. And then he also supported Catholicism and Sikhism, and people from coming up and outsiders coming in and learning from them and learning their cultural traits and traditions and technology. All right, now on to the Qing dynasty. Now, to talk about the Qing dynasty, they were ruled by the Manchus from Manchuria, which are actually ethnically and culturally distinct from the Han Chinese who were in control of China before. And, excuse me, they are going to actually, this ethnic and cultural distinction between Manchus and Han Chinese are actually going to lead to tensions. And the Qing, they put their own in top positions. They don't allow Han Chinese to get into top positions, just like the Ottomans didn't allow others to as well. But one thing they did is they did maintain a lot of the traditional Han Chinese practices, such as the bureaucratic system in the Chinese civil service exam. But really where the points of contention came from were in two areas. One is that the Manchus required all men, regardless of who you were and where you came from, to wear their hair in what was known as a queue, or in queues, plural, which is the Manchu braided pigtail, which you can see on screen. And this was actually meant to be a test of loyalty to the Manchus, and this is actually a constant reminder to many Han Chinese men that they were subjugated and being ruled by a foreign power, and this ultimately created a lot of tensions. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those specifically later. But what the Qing also did was they would actually use Han Chinese defectors to carry out massacres against those Han that were disloyal to them. And I give you two examples on screen where they would actually go in and massacre whole towns of Han Chinese that were disloyal, whether it was just one or a small group or the entire town. There's instances where they would go in and kill everyone to make sure that they said, hey, look, we're going to rule and we're in control. All right, next onto the European hierarchy. Now, one thing I want to mention before we go into this is the social structure that was in place under feudalism. And this is your kind of vassals or knights. It's all nobility. But I want to make sure you guys understand that even though this feudalism goes away, this social structure actually, in a way, still maintains itself. So the top levels are the royal family, your kings, queens, and so forth. Then you have your nobility, which are your wealthy landowners, and they, for the most part, have special privileges, such as owning land, the amount of money they have, granting power, titles, all this other stuff. But the way this system was maintained was through inheritance of land and titles, and protections and resources. But in some cases, we actually see as feudalism breaks down, and even though you still have the same structure, you see nobility gaining more active roles in government and how it actually functions, whether it's in the Netherlands, where you see more of a republic develop, and the nobility play a significant role, or in England, where parliament develops and the large landowners actually grow to control it. And you will see a constitutional monarchy and stuff take shape during the latter part of this period in the 1600s. But ultimately, what you're going to see is you're going to see a struggle for power, whether it's at the beginning between the royalty and the nobility, or as time progresses through this era and the Enlightenment and scientific revolution take place, you have emerging middle class instead of commoners, and emerging religious class again, and that's going to complicate the power struggle and class struggle. The key person to know for this period, because what we'll talk about on the next slide, is King Louis XIV of France. And in mid-1600s France, there's actually an uprising by the nobility and commoners against the French crown. And this uprising actually led to him believing that nobody else could have power except for him, the king. And this leads us into the age of what we call the age of absolutism in Europe, where King Louis XIV viewed that he had absolute control and complete control in the state. And he actually even made the statement, I am the state, which meant the state didn't operate without him. He was the ruler, and France only exists because of him. Now, one thing you guys need to understand, this wasn't the view of all rulers throughout Europe, whether it was Frederick of Prussia who said that, look, I am the ruler, but I I am here to serve the state, which he was known as an enlightened despot. But this is just kind of think in Europe, you have absolute rule. The kings and queens of Europe are trying to garner absolute control. Now, one of the things that actually allows them to do this is new pieces of technology such as gunpowder and cannons, which allow them to destroy noble fortresses or castles that from nobles that are actually working against the king or in dispute, or to even seize their land and say, look, we're taking control of this. Now, even though we talked about early on that in Europe there was they expelled the Jews, as the scientific revolution and enlightenment take off in the periods after the Renaissance, you do see Jews come back. So like the Jews that were pushed out of Spain from the Reconquista after 1492, they're known as Sephardic Jews, in where they settle in the areas around the Mediterranean. Some of them come back. And primarily the reason why is because you see an opening up of culture and trade. And where the Jews actually excel in this is they come to play an important role in banking and commerce throughout Europe. In particular, they play a huge role in the Netherlands because the Netherlands were practicing complete religious toleration. All right, now onto the Russian social classes here. We only have a couple more slides left. The Russian Empire, when that was founded and so forth, they actually continued the same social hierarchy system that was put in place by the Kievan Russian Empire. And the structure is pretty straightforward. At the top, you have what are people known as the boyars. So you have the noble family, and then the boyars, the landowning nobles. Then you have the small class, middle class, and merchants, just kind of like what we've been talking about in all the other structures. And then you have the peasants, and they're the most numerous. But what ends up happening is over time in this structure, they gradually sink deeper and deeper into debt, where they essentially become serfs, which means they're bound directly to the land. And if a nobleman sells this land to another, they just shift with the other noble, which in a sense is almost like slavery, and there's very little freedom. This will actually play itself out in Russian history as we develop through this period and go into the early part of period 5, as you're going to see serf revolts and so forth because of how low of status they are and just how hard the life they have. Now, the tensions that are going to develop between the noble family or the royalty in Russia and the landowning elite, the boyars, are pretty much the exact same that develop in Western Europe. And an example of this is Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible. When his actions against the nobility of Novgorod, when he takes over that city, they gain a lot of resentment towards him because he's wary of what they're going to do and how they're going to subjugate his rule or try to circumvent it. He actually forces them to move to Moscow so he can keep a watchful eye on it. Kind of similar in terms of how King Louis XIV treated nobility as well. All right, last slide here. We have the Americas. So what you have to know about the Americas is two things. First off, just one's broad, one's specific. So from a broad standpoint, we see that with the arrival of Europeans, the importing of African slaves, and the disease outbreaks, which leads to just catastrophically destroying the indigenous or native populations, all of this leads to a drastic social structural change. And all this combination leads to a social hierarchy that's based on race and ancestry. And this is going to start with the Spanish and the Portuguese, but it's going to expand and be used in different terms and so forth, but throughout all the other European colonies, whether it's in the Americas or we get into colonialism and imperialism in all throughout the world. But essentially what's going to happen is this, right? What you need to know is overall is that skin color is going to become a signifier of power and status within these empires, in these colonies. All right, and in particular for this unit, you guys need to know what the casta system is. And I gave you the picture here actually tells you exactly what it is as well, so it's kind of nice. It goes with the text. This here is you have the top, you have the Peninsulares. They're Spanish-born people that have come across into the Americas. The Criollos, I can't pronounce that, I'm sorry. the American-born Europeans. Then you have the castas, which is mixed race and ancestry of mestizos, which are Europeans, a mixture of Europeans and natives. Mulattoes, which are a mixture of Europeans and Africans, and then Zambos, which are a mixture of indigenous or natives and Africans. And the three other things you guys need to know here is at the bottom are the remaining indigenous people and enslaved Africans. So that's the bottom of it. Then people were assigned to these levels upon their baptism, and they could only move up. They couldn't move up unless there was intermarriage that happened. And then lastly, the bottom tiers, just like we see in all these others, whether it's the Russian serfs, European peasants, they're the ones that actually pay the higher amounts of taxes and tributes, even though in most cases they can't. And again, as you guys know, when this happens, there are going to be peasant revolts and tensions that will happen from the bottom up. And we'll get into that a little bit later in when we do period 5 and we talk about actual revolutions that take place. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Have a good one.